Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps forgotten history alive. January 11th, 1944. 29,000 feet above Germany. The air is thin enough to kill. Inside the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress, the waist gunner scans the sky. His breath fogs the glass. His hands shake, not from cold, but from certainty. They are alone. No fighter escort. No cavalry. Just 60 tons of aluminum and hope, crawling across hostile sky at 170 miles per hour. Below them, somewhere in the clouds, German radar operators are already calling it in. The Luftwaffe doesn't need to rush. They know the script by heart. American bombers fly deep. American fighters turn back. And then the killing begins. For 2 years, this has been the pattern. The arithmetic of attrition. The inevitability of mathematics. German pilots climb, intercept, destroy. They do it with confidence. With routine. Sometimes they even laugh. The gunner sees them first. Focke-Wulf 190s. Sleek, fast, deadly. Peeling out of the sun like wolves descending on sheep. His intercom crackles. The pilot's voice is calm. Too calm. They've been here before. Fighters, 12 o'clock high. The bomber formation tightens. 50 caliber machine guns swivel. Tracers arc across the void. Steel meets steel at closing speeds that defy comprehension. A B-17 to the left takes a cannon round through the cockpit. It drops, spinning, trailing black smoke and the screams of 10 men. The Luftwaffe pilots pull away. They're not retreating. They're reloading. This is the moment, the razor's edge between survival and annihilation, where wars are won or lost. Not by courage. Not by strategy. But by a single, brutal question. How far can your protection reach? For the Americans, the answer has always been the same. Not far enough. But something is different today. Something the German pilots haven't seen before. Something that shouldn't be possible. In the distance, cutting through 30,000 feet of frozen air, a formation of silver fighters banks into view. Sleek. Fast. Unfamiliar. They don't turn back. They don't peel away. They keep coming. The Luftwaffe radio chatter shifts. Confusion. Irritation. Then something closer to disbelief. Because these aren't the clumsy P-47 Thunderbolts that lumber home after 300 miles. These aren't the short-legged Spitfires tethered to English coastlines. These are P-51 Mustangs. And they've just escorted American bombers all the way to Berlin. How did a fighter that Germany dismissed as irrelevant become the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back? The air war over Europe was never supposed to last this long. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, American planners believed in a simple doctrine: precision daylight bombing. Fly high. Bomb accurately. Destroy Germany's war machine at its source. The theory was elegant. The execution was catastrophic. By 1943, the 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging bombers faster than factories could replace them. Missions into Germany became suicide runs. Crews calculated their odds of survival not in months, but in missions. 25 was the magic number. Most didn't make it past 5. The problem wasn't the bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were engineering marvels. Bristling with machine guns. Armored. Resilient. They could absorb punishment that would disintegrate lesser aircraft. But they were slow. Predictable. And without fighter escorts deep into German territory, they were defenseless. German fighter pilots exploited this weakness with surgical precision. They let the American escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, exhaust their fuel over France. Then, as those fighters turned for home, the Luftwaffe struck. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. Cannon fire that shredded aluminum like paper. Rocket salvos that turned bombers into fireballs. The Americans tried everything. They flew in tighter formations. They increased defensive armament. They even experimented with remote-controlled gun turrets. Nothing worked. By the summer of 1943, the strategic bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. Losses were unsustainable. Morale was fracturing. And the German war machine, Messerschmitt factories, ball bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, continued churning out weapons. The Allies needed a miracle. What they got was a compromise born of desperation. Enter the North American P-51 Mustang. At first glance, the Mustang seemed unremarkable. Designed in 1940 by North American Aviation, it was intended as a fighter for Britain, not America. Early models were fast but underwhelming. Their Allison engines struggled above 15,000 feet. The Royal Air Force relegated them to low-altitude reconnaissance. The Mustang should have been a footnote, a failed experiment. But someone noticed something the engineers had overlooked. The airframe itself was extraordinary. Its laminar flow wing sliced through air with minimal drag. Its aerodynamics were flawless. All it needed was a better engine. In late 1942, British engineers married the Mustang's sleek body to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. The transformation was instantaneous. The P-51B could fly faster than 440 miles per hour. It could climb to 40,000 feet. And with drop tanks, it could escort bombers over 1,000 miles. Suddenly, the impossible became inevitable. Sometimes, the weapon that changes history isn't the one anyone expected. It's the one that was almost thrown away. By January 1944, the first P-51 Mustangs arrived in England. German intelligence dismissed them. Just another Allied fighter. Another temporary nuisance. The Luftwaffe had no idea they were staring at their own obsolescence. Because the Mustang didn't just extend the range of American fighter escorts. It shattered the fundamental assumption that had governed air combat since 1939, that fighters couldn't protect bombers deep into enemy territory. The rules of the sky were about to be rewritten. In blood. The first deep penetration mission with Mustang escorts launched on March 4, 1944. Target: Berlin. 600 bombers, 100 Mustangs, and 1,500 miles of hostile airspace. German radar stations tracked the formation from the moment it crossed the Dutch coast. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled from airfields across occupied Europe. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s. Veterans with dozens of kills. Men who had turned bomber interception into lethal science. They climbed through the clouds, expecting the usual pattern. Wait for the American escorts to turn back. Then strike. But the escorts didn't turn back. At 200 miles into Germany, where P-47s would normally peel away, the Mustangs stayed. At 300 miles, still there. At 400 miles, deep into the heart of the Reich, the Silver Fighters remained locked in formation with the bombers. Luftwaffe pilots radioed back in confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. This violated the fundamental logic of fighter range, fuel capacity, physics itself. One German ace, Major Heinz Bahr, recorded his disbelief in his post-mission report. The Americans have fighters that can follow us home. This changes everything. The first engagement happened over Brunswick. A staffel of Bf-109s dove on a bomber formation from 25,000 feet. Standard tactics. Overwhelming speed. Devastating firepower. But this time, the Mustangs met them head-on. The P-51 had advantages German pilots hadn't anticipated. It was faster in a dive, more maneuverable at high altitude, and its 650 caliber machine guns could shred a Messerschmitt's thin aluminum skin in a single burst. The dogfight lasted 4 minutes. 3 Bf-109s went down. The Mustangs lost none. The bomber formation continued unscathed. This was the moment the Luftwaffe realized they weren't just facing a new fighter. They were facing a new kind of war. One where American bombers could strike anywhere in Germany with impunity. Where Luftwaffe pilots, once predators, had become prey. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German fighter pilots had spent 2 years perfecting the art of bomber interception. They knew every weakness. every blind spot, every vulnerable approach angle. Their confidence wasn't arrogance. It was earned through hundreds of successful kills. Now, that confidence evaporated. Because suddenly, every interception became a gamble. Attack the bombers, and Mustangs would tear you apart from above. Engage the Mustangs, and you'd burn through fuel dogfighting while the bombers destroyed your homeland below. There was no winning move. Only degrees of losing. The March 4th mission continued deeper. Leipzig, Dresden, Berlin itself. The Mustangs escorted the bombers all the way to the target, through the flak-filled skies over the German capital, and back out again. Total bomber losses, 69 aircraft. Devastating, but manageable. More importantly, the Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters. Pilots. Irreplaceable expertise. Veterans who had survived years of combat, now erased in a single afternoon. But the numbers told only part of the story. What broke the Luftwaffe wasn't just the kill ratio. It was the relentlessness. Before the Mustang, German pilots could rest between bomber waves. Rearm. Refuel. Recover. Now, American fighters patrolled German airspace for hours. They hunted Luftwaffe squadrons even after the bombers turned for home. They strafed airfields, shot up planes on the ground, killed pilots as they parachuted to safety, a brutal, illegal tactic that American commanders unofficially encouraged. The Luftwaffe was being ground down not in decisive battles, but through exhaustion. Attrition. The slow, mathematical inevitability of superior resources. German ace Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, understood what was happening. He wrote in his diary, "We are losing the war in the air not because our pilots lack courage, but because we lack time. We lack fuel. We lack planes. And now, we lack safety even over our own territory." The Americans called it air superiority. The Germans had a simpler term, Luftherrschaft, air domination, the complete, suffocating control of the sky. And with every mission, the Mustangs tightened their grip. By April 1944, the 8th Air Force was launching missions with over 1,000 bombers, escorted by 300 Mustangs. The bomber stream stretched for 50 miles, a river of aluminum and destruction that blotted out the sun. German pilots stopped laughing. They stopped making jokes over the radio. Many stopped flying altogether. Luftwaffe pilot Heinrich Oehler would later testify, "When we saw the Mustangs, we knew the mission was already lost. The only question was whether we would survive to fly another day." The war in the air had become a war of nerves. And the Mustang had shattered German morale as effectively as it shattered German fighters. But why? What made this particular aircraft so lethal? What combination of engineering, timing, and strategic vision turned an overlooked design into the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe? The answer lies not in the sky, but on the ground. In factories. In fuel tanks. In the invisible infrastructure of industrial war. Few people today realize that the P-51 Mustang wasn't designed to win the air war over Europe. It was designed to fulfill a British purchasing contract. In April 1940, before America entered the war, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request. Britain was desperate for fighters. The Battle of Britain was months away. Spitfire production couldn't keep pace with losses. The British needed something, anything that could fly and fight. They asked North American to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmud, made a counteroffer. "Instead of building someone else's mediocre fighter, give us 120 days, and we'll design something better." The British, skeptical but desperate, agreed. Schmud and his team worked with obsessive intensity. They studied every fighter design available. German, British, Russian, American. They identified what worked and what failed. Then they built something that combined the best elements of all of them. The result was the NA-73X, the prototype that would become the Mustang. Its laminar flow wing was revolutionary. Traditional wings created turbulence that increased drag and reduced speed. The Mustang's wing allowed air to flow smoothly across the surface, cutting drag by nearly 30%. This meant higher speed, longer range, and better fuel efficiency. Its fuselage was sleek and aerodynamic. Its cooling system, often an engineering nightmare, was integrated into the airframe itself, reducing drag even further. And it was cheap. While a Spitfire cost over £12,000 to manufacture, the Mustang cost less than half that. But there was a problem. The Allison V1710 engine that powered the early Mustangs was inadequate at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, performance dropped catastrophically. The Mustang was fast and agile at low level, but bomber escorts fought at 25,000 feet or higher. For 2 years, the Mustang languished in obscurity. Then, in April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker flew a Mustang on a routine evaluation. He was stunned by its handling. And he had an idea. What if they replaced the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin? The Merlin was the most advanced piston engine in the world. It powered Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancaster bombers. It was supercharged for high-altitude performance. It was reliable. And it produced over 1,500 horsepower. The combination seemed obvious. But institutional inertia nearly killed it. The U.S. Army Air Forces were skeptical. They had invested heavily in the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning. Both were excellent fighters. Both were already in production. Why divert resources to an unproven hybrid? But a small group of advocates, pilots, engineers, and mid-level officers, pushed the idea forward. They argued that range, not firepower, was the critical factor. That the bomber offensive would fail without long-range escorts. That the Mustang, properly engined, could fly farther than any fighter in existence. In October 1942, the first Merlin-powered Mustangs, designated P-51B, rolled off the production line. The performance improvements were staggering. Top speed, 440 miles per hour. Ceiling, 41,900 feet. Range with drop tanks, 1,650 miles. Combat radius, over 750 miles. No other fighter in the world could match those numbers. But range alone didn't win the war. Production scale did. By 1944, American industry had achieved something no other nation could replicate. The United States was producing over 9,000 aircraft per month. Factories operated 24 hours a day. Assembly lines stretched for miles. Workers, many of them women who had never touched an airplane before, riveted, welded, and wired with assembly line precision. North American Aviation's Inglewood, California plant became the most efficient aircraft factory in history. At peak production, they completed one P-51 every 45 minutes. The Germans, by contrast, were collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing. Messerschmitt factories in Regensburg and Wiener Neustadt were repeatedly destroyed. Ball bearing plants in Schweinfurt, critical for fighter production, were reduced to rubble. Germany's synthetic oil refineries, already struggling to meet demand, were obliterated. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had plenty of pilots. What they lacked were planes and fuel. German fighter production actually increased in 1944 despite the bombing. But getting those fighters into the air became nearly impossible. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Training programs were slashed from 200 hours to less than 50. New pilots entered combat with minimal experience, where they faced American veterans who had logged over 300 hours. The kill ratios reflected this disparity. In early 1943, Luftwaffe pilots shot down 2 American aircraft for every German loss. By late 1944, that ratio had reversed. American pilots were killing 5 Germans for every 1 lost. This wasn't because American pilots were inherently superior. It was because they had better planes, more fuel, more training, and more support. The Mustang was the tip of a much larger spear. Behind it stood the full industrial might of the United States. Factories, refineries, training programs, logistics networks that stretched across oceans. Germany was fighting the entire American economy. And losing. Few people today realize that the decisive battles of World War II weren't fought on beaches or in forests. They were fought in factories, in oil refineries, in training academies. The front lines were everywhere and nowhere. The P-51 Mustang was the visible symbol of American industrial supremacy. But the real weapon was the system that produced 15,000 Mustangs in 2 years. That trained 30,000 pilots. That shipped millions of gallons of high-octane fuel across the Atlantic. Germany never had a chance. But the Luftwaffe didn't surrender quietly. In the spring of 1944, they prepared one last, desperate gamble. A counteroffensive that would either destroy the American bomber offensive or break the Luftwaffe forever. April 29, 1944. Berlin. Luftwaffe High Command. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring convened an emergency meeting with his senior fighter commanders. The topic: how to stop the American daylight bombing campaign before it destroyed what remained of German industry. The statistics were catastrophic. In just 3 months, the 8th Air Force had flown over 20,000 bomber sorties into Germany. German fighter losses exceeded 1,000 aircraft. Pilot casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, numbered in the thousands. The Mustang had become an existential threat. Göring, once a World War I ace and architect of the Luftwaffe's early dominance, refused to accept defeat. He demanded solutions. Tactics. Technology. Anything that could turn the tide. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, presented a bold proposal, der Großschlag. The Great Blow. The plan was simple and suicidal. Concentrate every available fighter, over 2,000 aircraft, into a single, massive assault on an American bomber formation. Overwhelm the escorts through sheer numbers. Annihilate the bombers. Inflict losses so severe that America would be forced to halt daylight operations. It was a gamble. If it succeeded, Germany might buy months. If it failed, the Luftwaffe would be finished. Göring approved the plan. Preparations began immediately. But der Großschlag never happened. Because the Luftwaffe no longer controlled its own skies. Every time they massed fighters for the attack, Mustangs found them. Shot them up on the ground. Destroyed fuel depots. Strafed airfields. The Americans weren't just winning in the air. They were hunting the Luftwaffe into extinction. By May 1944, the plan was abandoned. The fighters that were supposed to deliver der Großschlag were instead diverted to defend against the Allied invasion of Normandy. This was the turning point. The moment the Luftwaffe's leadership realized they had already lost the air war. Not in a single climactic battle, but through the slow, grinding attrition of American industrial power. The moral and psychological impact was devastating. For German pilots, the realization came gradually, then all at once. At first, they told themselves they were facing bad luck. Poor weather. Tactical mistakes. But mission after mission, the pattern repeated. American bombers flew wherever they wanted. Mustangs dominated the sky. And Luftwaffe pilots died faster than they could be replaced. Veteran aces began refusing combat. Not out of cowardice, but out of mathematical certainty. Why throw away your life when the outcome was already decided? New pilots lasted days. Sometimes hours. They climbed into their Bf-109s or Fw-190s with minimal training, outdated tactics, and fuel tanks half empty. They faced American pilots flying superior aircraft with hundreds of hours of experience. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. One Luftwaffe pilot, Johannes Steinhoff, later wrote, "We knew we were dead men. The only question was when. Some of us prayed for mechanical failure. Better to crash on takeoff than face the Mustangs." But the Americans didn't know they had already won. From the cockpit of a Mustang or the bombardier seat of a B-17, the war still felt uncertain. Flak still tore through formations. German fighters still attacked with desperate ferocity. Men still died in fireballs at 30,000 feet. The psychological terror of high-altitude combat didn't diminish just because the statistics favored survival. Every mission was still a coin flip between life and death. American bomber crews calculated their odds obsessively. 25 missions for a tour of duty. After that, you could go home. But the math was brutal. With a 5% loss rate per mission, fewer than 30% of crews completed their tours. You did the arithmetic in your bunk at night. 5%. 25 missions. You ran the numbers and realized that statistically, you were already dead. This created a strange paradox. The Allies were winning the air war by every measurable metric. But the men actually fighting it, freezing in unpressurized bombers, watching friends incinerated by flak, felt anything but victorious. The truth was somewhere in between. Yes, the Mustang had broken the Luftwaffe's back. Yes, American bombers were systematically destroying Germany's war economy. Yes, air superiority was assured. But the cost was staggering. Over 26,000 American airmen would die in the skies over Europe. 77,000 tons of bombs would be dropped on German cities, killing over 300,000 civilians. Entire urban centers, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, would be reduced to ash. The Mustang didn't make the air war humane. It made it winnable. There's a difference. And as the spring of 1944 turned to summer, the full weight of that difference became inescapable. The Allies prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. D-Day. The liberation of Europe. It would only succeed if the Luftwaffe couldn't interfere. The Mustang had ensured that it wouldn't. But the killing wasn't over. Not even close. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The beaches of Normandy. 156,000 Allied troops stormed the French coast in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Above them, nearly 12,000 Allied aircraft controlled the sky. The Luftwaffe mustered fewer than 300 fighters. The air war was already over. The Germans just hadn't admitted it yet. In the months following D-Day, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Overlord's aerial component with devastating precision. Mustangs escorted bombers to targets across occupied Europe and deep into Germany. Oil refineries, tank factories, railway hubs, airfields. Nothing was safe. Nothing was beyond reach. German pilots who survived these missions described a surreal, nightmarish reality. You'd take off knowing American fighters were already circling above your airfield. You'd climb through flak from your own anti-aircraft guns, confused and shooting at anything. You'd reach altitude just in time to see a bomber stream 50 miles long, escorted by hundreds of Mustangs. And you'd have two choices: attack and die quickly, or retreat and die slowly, court-martialed for cowardice. Most chose the former. July 1944. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighters in a single month. Pilot casualties exceeded 1,500. Training schools couldn't replace losses. Fuel shortages grounded entire wings. And still the Americans came. The Mustang pilots, by contrast, operated with near-total impunity. They flew deep into Germany, hunting Luftwaffe formations before they could even take off. They strafed trains, trucks, supply depots. They shot up anything that moved. Some missions didn't even involve escorting bombers. They were pure fighter sweeps, roaming across Germany, destroying targets of opportunity. One Mustang pilot, Captain Don Gentile, became an ace by shooting down enemy aircraft both in the air and on the ground. His tactic was simple: find a German airfield, wait for planes to take off, then shoot them down in their climb. He called it hunting season. The Luftwaffe called it murder. But murder was now the standard operating procedure. Both sides had abandoned any pretense of chivalry. German pilots shot at parachuting Americans. Americans strafed parachuting Germans. Ground crews were fair game. Pilots on the tarmac were targets. The rules of engagement had collapsed into pure, industrial slaughter. And the Mustang was the perfect tool for it. Fast enough to chase down anything. Maneuverable enough to dogfight. Armed with enough ammunition to strafe a dozen targets before returning to base. And with enough range to hunt across an entire country. The psychological toll on German pilots became unbearable. Veteran ace Gunther Roll, who survived the war with 275 kills, later described the final months of 1944 as flying into a meat grinder. You knew you were going to die. The only question was whether it would be today or tomorrow. Suicide rates among Luftwaffe pilots spiked. Some pilots deliberately flew into the ground rather than face another mission. Others simply vanished, deserted, changed identities, disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Morale disintegrated. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount coordinated defenses. Squadrons operated independently, scattered across Germany, launching desperate, uncoordinated attacks that accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty lists. The Americans, sensing total victory, pressed harder. Big Week, a series of coordinated bombing raids in February 1944, had already crippled German aircraft production. Now, in the autumn of 1944, the Allies targeted oil. Synthetic fuel refineries in Ploesti, Romania, and across Germany were systematically destroyed. Without fuel, even the fighters Germany managed to build sat idle. Thousands of Bf-109s and Fw-190s never flew a single combat mission. They were parked in forests, camouflaged under trees, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The Luftwaffe was being starved out of existence. In September 1944, Adolf Galland wrote a final, desperate memo to Hitler. He outlined the collapse of the Luftwaffe in stark, unforgiving detail. He begged for resources, for fuel, for a change in strategy. Hitler's response was to relieve Galland of his command. The Führer had decided to invest everything in wonder weapons, jet fighters, rocket planes, technology that might turn the tide. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, entered service in July 1944. It was faster than anything in the sky. It could outrun Mustangs, outmaneuver them. In theory, it could have changed the air war. But there were too few. And they came too late. By the time Me-262s began flying combat missions, the Luftwaffe had already lost. Germany had no fuel, no experienced pilots, no functioning infrastructure. The jets were magnificent machines flown by boys with 50 hours of training, shooting at targets they couldn't catch because they ran out of fuel after 15 minutes. It was desperation disguised as innovation. And the Mustangs shot them down anyway. On November 2, 1944, Lieutenant Urban Drew became the first pilot in history to shoot down a jet aircraft. He caught an Me-262 during takeoff, when it was slow, vulnerable, and climbing, and blew it apart with a single burst. The wonder weapon had become just another statistic. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of itself. And the men who once laughed at unescorted American bombers were either dead, captured, or praying for the war to end. The air war over Europe ended not with a climactic battle, but with silence. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. What remained were scattered squadrons, obsolete aircraft, and pilots too young or too old to have any chance of survival. The bombers continued. The Mustangs continued. But there was no one left to fight. German cities burned under waves of incendiary bombs. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. The strategic rationale, destroying military-industrial targets, had long since blurred into total war. Entire urban centers were razed not because they housed factories, but because they existed. The Mustang pilots flew through smoke so thick it blotted out the sun. They returned to England with soot on their canopies and the smell of burning flesh in their oxygen masks. No one talked about it. What was there to say? Victory had become mechanical. Routine. You flew the mission. You destroyed the target. You landed. You drank. You slept. And the next morning, you did it again. The emotional numbness was universal. American bomber crews who once celebrated every completed mission now barely registered survival. 25 missions had seemed impossible in 1943. By 1945, some crews had flown over 50. They'd watched too many friends die, seen too many cities erased, killed too many people. War had become a job. A brutal, exhausting, soul-crushing job. For the Germans, the collapse was total. Not just military, but existential. Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried scars that went far beyond the physical. Many refused to fly again. Some couldn't bear the sound of aircraft engines. Others woke screaming from nightmares of burning cockpits and Mustangs diving out of the sun. The psychological term didn't exist yet, but the symptoms were unmistakable. Post-traumatic stress. Survivor's guilt. Moral injury. Because many of them understood, in the end, what they had been fighting for. They'd defended a regime that had committed atrocities beyond comprehension. They'd protected factories that built weapons for genocide. They'd delayed the inevitable collapse of a government that deserved to be destroyed. And tens of thousands of them had died doing it. The Mustang pilots faced their own reckoning. Yes, they'd won. Yes, they'd been on the right side. Yes, their sacrifices had helped liberate Europe and end the Nazi regime. But the cost haunted them. How many German pilots had they killed? How many cities had they helped destroy? How many civilians had died in the firestorms their bombers ignited? These weren't questions anyone wanted to answer. So they didn't. They went home. They collected their medals. They told sanitized versions of their stories at dinner parties and Veterans Day ceremonies. They became heroes in the American mythos, brave young men who defeated evil and saved the world. And in private, many of them drank themselves to sleep. The P-51 Mustang became a legend. The fighter that won the war. The plane that saved the bomber offensive and guaranteed Allied victory. Museums displayed them. Airshows flew them. Historians celebrated them. All of it was true. And none of it captured the full reality. Because the Mustang wasn't just a symbol of technological superiority or tactical brilliance. It was a weapon of industrial warfare, a tool for translating American economic might into German casualties. It did its job efficiently, ruthlessly, and at a scale that still defies comprehension. Between January 1944 and May 1945, P-51 Mustangs destroyed over 4,900 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. They flew over 213,000 combat sorties. They escorted bomber formations that dropped over 1.5 million tons of explosives on Axis targets. The human cost? Over 2,500 Mustang pilots killed, wounded, or captured. Over 26,000 American airmen dead. Over 40,000 Luftwaffe pilots killed. Over 300,000 German civilians killed in the strategic bombing campaign. Numbers that become meaningless through their magnitude. But behind every number was a person. A name. A story. Someone's son or brother or husband who climbed into a cockpit and never came home. The Mustang made victory possible. But it didn't make it clean. And as the war ended, as the survivors returned home, as the ruins of Germany smoldered, as the full scope of the Holocaust was revealed, a question lingered. Was it worth it? The answer depends on who you ask. And when. 80 years later, P-51 Mustangs still fly. At airshows across America, vintage Mustangs roar across the sky, their Merlin engines echoing the ghosts of a war most people alive today never witnessed. Crowds cheer. Children point. Veterans salute. And the planes themselves, polished, pristine, stripped of their kill markings and invasion stripes, look almost innocent. But they're not innocent. No weapon of war ever is. The P-51 Mustang represents one of history's strangest paradoxes. It was designed by accident, perfected through improvisation, and deployed at the exact moment when industrial warfare reached its terrible apex. It wasn't the best fighter of World War II. The German FW-190 was arguably more lethal in a dogfight. The British Spitfire was more beloved. The Japanese Zero was more maneuverable. But the Mustang had something none of them possessed, range coupled with mass production. And in the end, that's what won the war. Not heroism, not tactics, not even technology, but the ability to put overwhelming force anywhere on the planet and sustain it indefinitely. The Mustang was the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy. Every rivet, every bolt, every gallon of fuel represented a supply chain that stretched across oceans and continents. Behind every Mustang that crossed into German airspace stood thousands of factory workers, engineers, logistics officers, and support personnel. Germany never had a chance against that system. Neither did Japan. The outcome was determined not in 1944 when the Mustangs arrived, but in 1941 when America's industrial base mobilized for total war. The battles in the sky were just the visible symptom of a much larger economic stranglehold. But knowing that doesn't diminish the courage of the men who flew. It doesn't erase the terror of combat at 30,000 feet, where one bullet in the wrong place meant death. It doesn't lessen the sacrifice of those who never came home. The Mustang pilots did their duty. They fought with skill and bravery. Many of them paid the ultimate price. They deserve to be remembered. Not as mythological heroes, but as human beings thrust into an inhuman conflict. The same is true for the Luftwaffe pilots they fought against. Many were defending their homeland. Many opposed the Nazi regime. Many were simply young men trying to survive a war they hadn't started. War doesn't care about nuance. It only cares about victory. And the P-51 Mustang delivered victory with cold, mechanical efficiency. Today, historians debate the ethics of the strategic bombing campaign. Was the destruction of German cities militarily necessary or morally indefensible? Could the war have been won with fewer civilian casualties? Should the Allies have targeted infrastructure instead of population centers? These are important questions. Uncomfortable questions. But they're questions that only make sense in hindsight, from the comfort of peace. In 1944, the men making those decisions faced a different calculus. Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. It was building weapons of mass destruction. It was systematically murdering millions in concentration camps. Stopping that required overwhelming force. And the Mustang provided it. Whether that justifies the means is something each person must decide for themselves. What's not debatable is the impact. The P-51 Mustang changed the nature of air warfare forever. It proved that fighters could escort bombers across entire continents. It demonstrated that air superiority could be achieved and maintained through industrial-scale production. It established doctrines that would shape military aviation for the next 80 years. Every modern fighter jet, from the F-15 to the F-35, traces its conceptual lineage back to the Mustang. Long range, air superiority, deep penetration strikes. These weren't just tactics. They became the foundation of American military doctrine. The Mustang showed that wars could be won not just on battlefields, but in factories. Not just with soldiers, but with supply chains. It was a lesson America took to heart, and one its adversaries learned too late. As the last veterans of World War II pass away, the stories they carried begin to fade. The terror of combat, the exhaustion of survival, the guilt of violence, the pride of victory. Soon, the only Mustangs left will be the polished museum pieces and airshow performers. Beautiful machines divorced from their brutal purpose. But the truth remains, preserved in archives and histories and the memories of those who lived it. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the instrument through which American industrial power was translated into German defeat. It was the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back and guaranteed Allied air superiority. It was the reason Berlin burned. The reason the invasion of Europe succeeded. The reason the war in Europe ended in May 1945 instead of dragging on for years. German pilots laughed at unescorted American bombers, until P-51 Mustangs escorted them all the way to Berlin. And then the laughing stopped. Forever. If you're still watching, you're one of the few who keep forgotten history alive. This story, the engineers who built the Mustang, the pilots who flew it, the men who died fighting against it, deserves to be remembered in all its complexity. Not as propaganda, not as mythology, but as what it was, a chapter in humanity's most devastating conflict, written in contrails and blood. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories that don't simplify. Stories that honor the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Because history isn't about heroes and villains. It's about human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. And the P-51 Mustang was at the center of one of the most impossible choices ever made. The choice to win a war, no matter the cost.